Good evening and welcome to our discussion with CEG Democracy Fellow, Jen Pahlka. My name is Sadia Sindhu and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Effective Government. We, alongside our partners with the Seminary Co-op and Chicago Public Media, are excited to have this conversation that engages deeply with questions of government effectiveness, policy implementation, and how to modernize our institutions for the digital age. The Center for Effective Government's mission is to study, debate, and enhance public understanding of reforms that have the potential to strengthen our democratic institutions and improve the capacity of government to solve public problems. A big part of that work occurs through our Democracy Fellowship Program, which allows us to bring incredible practitioners to campus to share their insights on critical issues related to government effectiveness and the health of our democracy. Tonight, we're thrilled to have one of those fellows here to speak about her book, Recoding America: Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. You'll have the opportunity today to hear Jen and CEG Director Will Howell speak about various aspects of Recoding America, and we'll save about 15 minutes for audience questions. When the time comes, please submit your questions on our Slido page through the QR code to my right. Tonight's conversation will also be recorded and shared on the Center for Effective Government's YouTube page. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our two participants. Jen Pahlka, author of Recoding America, CEG Democracy Fellow, and a Senior Fellow at the Niskanen Center, is a pioneer in making government work in the digital age. In 2010, she founded Code for America, a national nonprofit that brings the principles and practices of the digital era to government. While U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the Obama White House from 2013 to 2014, Jen helped found the United States Digital Services, which brings world-class technologists and designers to government to improve digital service delivery. Will Howell is a Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, where he holds appointments in the Harris School, the Political Science Department, and the college. He's also the co-host of the Not Another Politics podcast, and most importantly, Will is the director of the Center for Effective Government. Will has written widely on separation of powers issues and American political institutions. He is currently writing his next book that examines the rise of the strongman presidency, and he's technically on sabbatical this year, but I guess there really is no break from the work of democracy reform. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Will, so you and Jen can have this wonderful conversation, and we look forward to the Q&A session.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sadia. We've been looking forward to you coming here, and we're going to talk about bureaucracy and tech, and you might think that's, I don't know, from afar, those are sort of not the sexiest topips.
Yeah.
But
okay.
you're kind of a rock star. And you've written this really important book.
In a very, very small universe.
Yeah, not at all. No, this is really it's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
And we are fortunate to have you here to talk about it, and we're going to try to unpack it. And
Great.
I thought, rather than lead with a kind of big open-ended question, we should just dive right in.
I can do that.
And we should get after it. And usually points of entries, they look like, well, let's start with the people, or let's start with stories. But this is the Center for Effective Government, and we think a lot about institutions. And so I thought a place that we might start in talking about your book is with those institutions, the landscape that you're looking at, and you have this really powerful metaphor that you return to throughout the course of the book about waterfalls. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about waterfalls as the kind of institutional backdrop that tech is trying to intervene in when it engages government.
Yeah, we'll do that. Well, just first of all, thanks for having me. If I'd known how great a time I was going to have here, I would have come much sooner. It's just a wonderful environment here, so it's just been such a pleasure. Yeah, it's funny because some of my world is still sort of the tech world where waterfall means a very specific thing. And I think for a long time, we talked about these concepts of agile development of software versus waterfall development. And I think it's still a useful concept. But what I'm talking about the book is not just let's bring agile development to government, but the recognition that it's much more than a software development practice. in the waterfall software development method, you do things in a certain order and you never go back. So you start by defining your requirements, and then you develop, and then you test, and then you deploy it. And you wouldn't test all the way along. You would never say, oh, here we are at step 3, we're going to change the requirements. That's sort of considered a sin. Whereas in agile development, you are sort of build, measure, learn. You're in a build, measure, learn cycle all the way through. You're working with your users. The reason it's hard to do agile development of software in government is that government itself is a waterfall. And the key element of that is not just we have a hierarchy. Like, everything has a hierarchy. Companies have hierarchies. I'm not trying to say we can't have those, but we do sort of start at the top, and there isn't really a return trip. There's no way in our current structures, or there isn't enough of a way when you're in the lower tiers of it, actually deploying, trying to build something that works for people, ordered by, say, a law that came from up above, to go back and say, we need to do this differently. We've learned something in the course of doing this work. We're not in a build, measure, learn cycle the whole way that government's structured. And I'm advocating less for, of course, I like agile development, but for breaking the waterfall of government itself.
Yes. Yes. Yes, so you're pushing back against this really naive notion that tech problems are just about writing good code and handing that off to people who then run that code and then solve problems. Is that it has to be integrated into political institutions that have this hierarchy and these qualities wherein we have, at the top, we have sort of, it's kind of like a cascading waterfall, right?
Yes.
We've got,
Let's say waterfall's a terrible metaphor for it in a certain way, because it's really steps. Right? I mean, water would actually flow, and there'd be a connection between it. But it's, you start at a step, and you go down a step, and you go down a step, and you can't go back. Yeah.
And at the top of it are the people who are writing the laws, who are establishing policy, and they're the high-minded, important people in their minds.
Yes.
Right?
Well, let's be gentle. Maybe I'm not that gentle
we don't have
in the
to be
book,
gentle
so.
Here.
Yes, I do talk about another concept in the book, and I had sort of tried to express this awkwardly, and a friend of mine who worked in the UK government said, oh, there's a name for that. In the British civil service, they actually talk about the difference between the intellectuals and the mechanicals. The service is split into two, and you're one or the other. It's a kind of old concept. They don't use the language very often anymore because it's sort of distasteful, but it's there. It's there as a concept, and I think we inherited it. And I love now that I get emails from people saying, I'm one of your mechanicals, like taking it as a point of pride. But there's a clear hierarchy that is implied by that. And there's power that comes with that. You have power at the top, and the mechanicals don't have as much power. But I think anybody in the room who would consider themselves a mechanical doing the work of implementation knows that we know things about what the policy should be, and we're not being asked.
Yes.
And there just needs to be a shift in power to break that waterfall so that we can get in this build, measure, learn cycle and actually write policy that gets the outcome that was intended because it is able to be implemented.
And I want us to get to the centrality of outcomes when we evaluate, when you ask us to evaluate what success looks like. But can you give us an example, just so we can sort of see it, of how the breakdown might happen, how an edict handed from on high in translation simply evaporates because these mechanicals who are meant to just salute and set to work on doing the bidding of these political superiors are hamstrung, or it's impossible to.
Trying to pick one. There's so many. I think I'll do, just because it's so relevant to my work right now. We have a lot of law and policy starting in, is it the 1870s when you have the Pendleton Act that tries to make sure that we're not, that we hire in government a very meritorious, unbiased way. Of course, because it used to be the spoils system, and it was kind of, because, Chicago has some issues with that in the past.
We never gave it up.
Right.
No.
Well, it's all about a balance.
Yeah.
So, basically, if you look at the law, it says we're going to hire on the basis of merit as a person qualified position. With one exception, we're going to give veterans a benefit, a preference in hiring. Well, if you go actually look at how that has been translated into practice now, maybe I'll indulge in some nerdy details here, right?
Do it.
And I hope this is federal government, so many of you here, I think, are in state and local government and probably see something similar. But, if you're if you're an HR person in an agency and a hiring manager comes to you and says, I need this person, so they say, great. There's a whole battle around writing the job description because you have to use a classification, or job description's already been written and approved and all this stuff. But let's say you get to that point and you post it. Then you get, say, 1,000 resumes for this thing. Well, your job now is to down select, and there's a way that you do it so that you believe that you cannot have subject matter experts review these because they will introduce bias, and it's your job to keep bias out. So the first thing you'll do is look for the exact words that are in the job description in their resume, and the closer that matches, the more that resume floats to the top, because it has to be unbiased. You're not using any judgment in that moment. In fact, I don't think I told the story in the book, but I did it in a prior writing about this. Yadira Sanchez, who's in chapter 11, she has literally had this thing where the person has very clearly copied and pasted, didn't change the font, didn't change the bullets, and she's given this person as the most qualified person. So you down select based on anybody who wrote something like I'm a Java programmer instead of I have the qualified experience of being an expert. They're now out, and you just have the people who copied and pasted. And then the second down select is you send them a qualifying assessment, but it is self-assessment. So they take all of the characteristics in the JD, and you rate yourself. And if you know to rate yourself as a master, and I kid you not, that's the word, on every single characteristic, then you make that next down select. And from that, they can apply veterans preference and hand a cert over. So I call this process culture eating policy. So the policy, the law, says let's be meritorious. In practice, there's two things that happen. You have to know how the system works to do that. You have to know how to write a government resume. You have to know to copy and paste, even though that's totally demeaning. You have to know to write master on every level. That is going to preference people who know people who work there already. It's hugely against the principle of bias. But one of the things that we found out when this team went and built a different system that did use subject matter experts to qualify people, and then the slates, the certs that the hiring managers were getting were of people who had actually been assessed to be good at the job, is that they would hand the cert to these folks, and they'd call up and say, wait a minute, you told me that this was going to be different. I see all veterans again. And they'd be like, no, these are qualified veterans. But what we learned from that is that whole system that was also designed to give veterans preference was creating bias against veterans, which was not really serving them either. So the two main goals of the law were not being served in practice. And it's this sort of, as it cascades through the hierarchy, that thing flips. From the law to the policy to the regulation to the process to the forms to the things that are given the weight of law within the bureaucracy, but they're not. They are simply arbitrary expressions of that law and policy.
So, two concerns.
Concerns.
There are lots of concerns. Two that pop up in
Yeah.
this particular story is one, an over-reliance on procedure.
Yes.
And coupled with a lack of discretion given
Yes.
to those who might have subject matter expertise to say, if what you want to do is get rid of bias, the thing to do, or get qualified people, the thing to do is to step back from a... So how would you encourage us to think about those two things? The importance of giving discretion to, are we going to keep calling them mechanics? Like the people who are implementing, right?
Yes.
Give them discretion and then relax the hold that procedure for procedure's sake has on how we evaluate their performance?
Nick Bagley has this great paper called The Procedure Fetish, and if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. It's on the Niskanen site. And he talks about the way that we pile procedure on procedure. It comes from, in his view, this anxiety about legitimacy and accountability. We don't want to have to say, like, I made that decision because I think that's the right person to hire. We need to say, this procedure happened, and that's why this person is the right person to hire, because we followed the procedure. But it's deeply rooted in our culture and this feeling that, our country, we're skeptical of government, and since the public is skeptical, we've got to be able to defend our decisions. And of course, it's rooted in the incentives of the civil service system. But the problem is that it's an anxiety about legitimacy and accountability that actually erode. If the purpose is to increase our legitimacy, it's having the opposite effect. Because by not getting the outcomes that those laws intended, we have a lower faith and trust in government. It also does not work for accountability, because it puts the person can then say, but I followed these procedures, so it's okay, rather than I got you a qualified Java programmer or whatever it was. And I don't mean to continue to use tech examples, because it can be anything. It can be a nurse, it can be a janitor, it can be a policy analyst. But we're hiding behind this anxiety about our legitimacy, and in that process, eroding it.
And job protections.
Yes.
It's like, I did the things I was supposed to do.
Yes.
Yes, the outcome is perverse, but I just did what I was supposed to do. And then it requires a kind of act of heroism in order to break out of that in the service of producing a better outcome, which makes you vulnerable. And yet it might deliver, vulnerable in the sense of, should you step out of that, you not check all the boxes, and things not work out, watch out.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what needs to happen if we're going to deliver the outcomes that we want to see.
I mean, I think a lot of public servants would say that most of what they do is fight for the right to use their judgment to get the outcome. And, it's just really hard. And it's not that they don't want to, it's that the system is forcing them into sort of predetermined decisions that I know are not the decision that is going to honor the intent of the law or policy. And that's the fight.
Yes. You make a distinction in the book between project managers and program managers?
Product, yeah.
Product.
Yes.
What's the distinction, and how does that tie into what we're discussing here?
It ties in, and also sort of bring it back to software, though I don't want to over-index on that. But so project management is very important in government because there's so much to do, and it's the art of getting things done. Project managers are the best, and we love them. But product management is a term borrowed from the tech world, and they briefly describe it as the art of deciding what to do. There's a big difference between doing all the things in a sort of unprioritized way and saying, for example, on a tech product, but again, this has broader implications, these are the important things to do. This is the goal of that thing. Some of these things aren't going to happen. What's really important is that this is going to work for the user. I mean, let me give you an example that's not tech, because I don't want to get stuck in that ghetto. I mean, right now, we are trying to speed the building of green infrastructure, especially under the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. But it takes a really long time to get through NEPA review, National Environmental Protection Act. And I want to return to that because there's a great sort of culture eats policy problem there. But if it's 12 different agencies have to look at a package as to permit one of these new projects. And each of those agencies is, without real product management, just doing all the possible things that you could conceive of doing to make a permit for, to clear the project for a permit, because in part, we like to just do all the things in government, and because we're going to get sued. But if there was a sort of product manager on that, someone would get all the agencies together and say, here are the 3 places they're going to sue us on this. We have to get an A+ in those. there's a bunch of other stuff that's not going to matter at all. Let's put our energy on this. And by the way, let's get this through in 6 months instead of 4 years, because we're not doing that long tail of stuff that no one actually cares about. And it's not actually required by law. Like NEPA originally said there is no individual review of projects. It does not actually require that. Somebody who knows the origins of the law described it to me as the authors of that law thought that 2 bureaucrats would chat for 15 minutes. And it's become 4 years. And not even about a particular project. It was just, are we generally in the direction of honoring, the environment? But it's just grown dramatically, and not just through the bureaucracy's desire to add procedure to legitimize, but also because of adversarial legalism, which is another problem, and sort of works with this anxiety.
Yeah. So, do we want to think about? The answer is probably all of the above, but. Roughly, do we want to think about the problem being institutional in nature or the problem being people in nature? That is, are we bringing in the right kinds of people with the right kinds of value, paying attention to outcomes as opposed to procedure, or is the problem institutional in nature because there are all these incentives to guard against being sued, being hauled before Congress, being fired by a political appointee, any number of things that then lead one to somebody who would be predisposed to pay attention to outcomes to kind of assume a kind of bunker mentality. People, institutions.
Well, yes, both. I
Yes.
mean, I think the after the fact criticism of my own book that I would provide is that I do talk a lot about these amazing public servants who are sort of, wrenching victory from the jaws of defeat and getting things done under really, really difficult circumstances and delivering great services to the American public. And I wanted to explain how they did it and why they did it, and sort of challenge people's preconceptions that healthcare.gov failed because we had bad programmers. Right, there's a lot more to it than that. And when you see a successful project, it's not just because there are better programmers, it's because we actually have the people doing the delivery of the service in dialogue with the policy people. And that conversation gets to happen such that we challenge these overly maximalist interpretations of the law that create these services that just aren't going to work. And so I wanted to tell these stories, and I'm happy that I told them. But the downside is that people conclude from the book that my solution is we need just more people like that. And of course we need more people like that, but there has to be systemic change. They have to be allowed to do that job. We have to burden them less. We have to empower them more. And that doesn't happen because, there's like 2 more great people or there are so many great people in government. If we can really push on the systemic change, we're going to have just an incredible, we're going to have an incredible government. We're going to have incredible outcomes. But the people are there. They're just, the incentives are wrong, and we're keeping them from doing what they want to do.
Waterfall.
It's a waterfall.
Can you say a little bit about, I think people would be interested to hear about what your diagnosis is of why healthcare.gov,
Healthcare.gov, yeah.
why it failed.
I feel like there's people in the room who worked on it, and I'm going to get in trouble. There's a fantastic report from the HHS Office of Inspector General that is totally correct, and it's really, there's not a lot of OIG reports that are real page turners, but that's a good one. And I mean, it just documents all of these things that sort of went wrong in the approach to it, and I co-sign all of that. But one thing it doesn't say is that it didn't have a product manager. So by which I mean they did not choose what to do first, and they did not choose what to prioritize. We had this waterfall essentially where like the law says this needs to happen, and it's got to work for all these people, and we're just going to do that. Now, despite the fact that actually there were many people saying, why don't we do a staged rollout where the first version of the site is only going to work for people with this set of uses, and then the edge case out here gets added the next month, and then that edge case gets added, because in the meantime we have these in-person service centers, we have the call center, we have other ways for people who have more complex situations to sign up. But there's just has sort of never in the history of technology been a website that worked with that degree of complexity for all of its users the first day. And nobody listened to those people. But I call it product management because it would be the art of saying, this is what we need to do first, this is what's important, we're prioritizing it, we're going to handle these users another way. Instead, it's, this is the list of requirements, it's wildly long, you must do them all, you must do them by a certain date. We don't want to hear it that that this isn't working. And Clay Shirky had a bunch of great lines about this. One of them was like, they kept saying failure is not an option. Well, like apparently it was, But failure is not an option is not a very helpful thing to say. Right. It's saying you're a mechanical, you don't have a voice, right? And his other great line, since we're on him, was they kept insisting that it could not have a staged rollout as it was having one, right? That's essentially what it was it did only work for 8 people the first day, and then they fixed it in real time as the plane was flying, instead of what you would do in best practice, which is start with a small group of people and add folks on later. It's product management. That is happening now in government. Has anybody heard about direct file? I don't think it's working in Illinois. Is Illinois one of the states? But see, it's going to come to Illinois, right? In a future iteration. So this is a new product from the IRS where they've said we're only launching to like 10,000 people, and eventually others can use it. But we've got to work out the bugs, not that just the technical bugs, but the usability bugs. Like, do people actually understand this? Are we testing the language? Are we testing the flow? And they're iterating as they go, and they've gotten terrible grief. I mean, I got calls from like 4 or 5 different journalists. Like, somebody tells me, isn't this bad that's only working for a small number of people? And I'm like, did Facebook work for everybody in the beginning? All these products that work well started small. That is industry best practice. And again, this is not me saying the tech industry has this figured out and government ought to learn from it, but that we need to make choices in government, prioritize things, and listen to the people who actually know how to implement.
And then build out.
And then build
out. And then
out.
say that what the product is going to be, or what the service delivery is going to be, is going to look like this, having learned.
Yes.
But it doesn't happen a whole bunch. We've got moments.
It's happening more.
It's happening more. So how do we think about the kind of moving towards the kind of systemic reform that you're interested in moving towards? Part of it is, and it comes through in the book, is that we need people who share these values to go out and to raise these issues in institutions. And
speak up.
And speak up.
Say, no, you actually have to listen to me. It's not going to work if you don't. Yeah, that's part of it.
So say a bit about other parts. Like how do we get from here to there?
Well, speaking of sort of concentric circles, I mean, I think this for me was sort of getting to the next circle. Like, policy people never used to want to talk to me. I would never have been invited here before. I was like the tech person. So I've gone from working with tech folks to working with program folks to actually having a conversation with policy folks to wait, there's a larger discussion here that that goes beyond. And where it eventually goes, I think, is actually going to change when the public's perception of government changes and what we expect from government changes. So, I'm very critical of government leaders who really only care about the policy. And I've spent time with folks, for instance, in the California state legislature. They had me go up there and talk to them. And I would ask these members of the legislature, do you follow up after you get one of your bills gets passed? And it was so funny because on the Hill in DC, they'll like come up with an answer because they know like no is the wrong answer. And in Sacramento, they're like, nope, don't care. Like, why would I do that? Like, I get elected on the basis of my legislative, record. And so what actually happens, whether the thing that I said should happen, has an impact on the people it's supposed to help is irrelevant to me, which is part of the reason California is kind of a mess. But, that's on us. Like, we are electing people. We are telling the candidates who ask for our dollar and our vote, tell me your legislative record, right? And my metaphor for this is a gardening metaphor. Ready? I'm a gardener, except now I live in DC, I don't have a garden. But they're saying my job as a policymaker, a lawmaker, is to plant seeds. And if those seeds in the form of a bill grow into something that provides shade or fruit or flowers for the public, then that's how I get reelected. Of course, we need to recognize they are often not growing, so let's start there. But second, anyone who's ever gardened knows that planting seeds is like 0.1% of the work. It's tending the soil and making sure there's water and sun. And very critically, it's weeding out what was there last season or what sort of volunteered, because you can't plant a seed if the garden is just choked with all these plants. And, in case my metaphor isn't clear, I'm talking about cleaning up policy clutter, regulatory clutter. If you look at unemployment insurance, one of the reasons I think it's been so challenging is that it dates to 1935 with the Social Security Act. So you have now 89 years of people adding rules, adding mandates, adding constraints, adding regulations, and they're never removed. That is a very, very choked garden. And we need to just do the weeding that allows that to grow again. But that's not going to happen until the public starts to say to their elected leaders, I need to know that we have a values match, and second, I need to know how you're tending the garden.
Mm-hmm. It won't do for you just to tell me that you enacted this number of laws or spent this amount of money. It's that you want to see follow through. So what would that look like in practice? That is, at a state level or at the national level, it would involve bringing folks in the bureaucracy to work directly with staff when bills are being contemplated and written. Literally at the drafting table, bring the folk up and let's talk it through and say, well, here's what's possible, here's what's not, given.
100%. I mean, and there's a story in the book about that as it relates to criminal records and being able to automate the expungement of them when the data structures were, amenable to it, and where other laws that were written without regard to what you could actually get data about were essentially unimplementable. And then I heard another story about that today. I won't call you out. But where if somebody said, look here, somebody drafting a bill had said, look, here's my intention. Let's bring some people who actually know how this would be implemented to the table so that it's written in such a way that they will be able to implement it. They would have written a different law. And, I've met many legislators now who tell me that, like, oh shit, I really just sort of would have had this conversation. If I'd had this conversation, we would have gone for something different. I realize now that it's not that there isn't the political process happening, right? Like, those two things happen together. There's still a negotiation between advocates and, other members of the legislature. I mean, there's all that going on, and I'm not saying it replaces that. I'm saying it's a layer in it that says, if we can decide on this goal together, let's bring different people to the table to write it so that it will be implementable.
Yep. So, okay, we're in a difficult spot, I think. We clearly are. But
right here now? Or
no, not right now.
Did I say something bad?
No. It's a thing that you want us to pay attention to as we construct policy and as we evaluate the government is the production of outputs. The outputs right now, the effects that are flowing from the monies that are spent and the laws that are written are suboptimal. They're not great. That in turn leads to public disaffection.
Right.
Public gets frustrated, which in turn leads to less willingness, not more, to roll up your sleeves and engage in the hard work that you would ask us to do. Because it's hard work to reconstitute waterfalls and to change procedures and rules and culture.
Yeah.
I mean, that plays out over a long time. And if the thing that's going to stimulate it are real wins, but the wins we're not getting precisely because of the existence of the waterfalls, how do we get there? I think what the answer is, you find them where you can and then you lift them up and you say, you see, it's possible.
Yes. I think that's part of the solution. Like the number of people who are like, give me some example of something working. You know, it's like, we do have examples. I mean, direct file is a great one now, but there's a bunch of others.
Tell that one.
Direct file?
Yeah.
Like how it came about?
And how you turned it into a win when it wasn't before.
Oh, it's not my project.
Sorry, I was thinking expungement.
Expungement, yes. Oh, you want to tell the expungement story?
Can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is when I was running Code for America, and we had a team looking at the fact that this law, Prop 47, had decriminalized or reclassified a bunch of felonies to misdemeanors, which is a huge thing in someone's life. Like living with a felony is very, very, very difficult. But was recognizing that, you know, only on paper are you no longer a felon, right? You have to go file all of this paperwork. And they were following people through it, and you have to go collect this information, fill out this form. The form's very confusing. If you have felonies in different counties, you have to do it separately. And even people with like lawyers helping them were not getting through this process. And most people who were starting it who couldn't afford a lawyer some of them had legal aid, but like there's not nearly enough legal aid people to help, right? Like that's a very limited resource, and you have a lot of people who needed this. So people weren't getting through. And so we learned a lot about that process, and we're trying to help it through some tech-enabled ways that I won't go into. But then another law passed, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, which had an even bigger impact on anybody who had a marijuana conviction. Now it's not illegal, so why would you be walking around with a felony conviction on your record? But in this case, this was a lot more people, and my team was sort of figuring out how you would do things like use your smartphone to take a picture of your rap sheet, and then have the computer be like, okay, I can see that these are the codes that map to, not computer codes, but codes in the criminal legal system that map to the things that can be expunged, and sort of fill out this thing for you. And at the same time, you had a very forward-leaning district attorney, Gascon, and his amazing chief of staff that were saying, why should people have to petition at all? But their definition of like automatic expungement was that they were having paralegals on their lunch hour fill out the form for people, which was a great thing to do, but it also did not scale, right? Like it takes a long time to look up this thing in the database and like fill it out. So they were trying to get it through, and neither one of these things was going to have the impact that we really needed to have if we were going to fulfill the intent of that law, which is like get this burden off of these people. And we realized, by talking to them, the felony is just it's a field in a database. Like you could just search in the database, say, here are all the people who are eligible for expungement, and expunge them. And, through that collaboration, we did the first truly automatic expungement. It was not automatic in the sense that we found the record and just changed it there. There still had to be a step. So what they did is they filled out one petition that had 9,632 names at the end of it and filed that with the courts. And then the CEGIS folks, the Criminal Justice Information System folks, then had to go actually change the record. So it wasn't as automatic as we'd hoped. So it's like this really big win, and that has actually spread around the country a little bit. But then we went back to do Prop 47. and expunge those, the one that we had started working on. And the thing about Prop 47 is that it says that felonies, something that is, say, a burglary of property under $950 is now a misdemeanor. Well, okay, so there's no field in the database that you can search on that. But more than that, you would have to go into every single file and find the piece of paper that some cop scribbled on that says what was stolen. And then you'd go, okay, I think he says a Canon Sure Shot 110. How much was that worth in 2001? Like, it's just, you can't do it. And it was the authors of that law who said to me, we would have just made different choices if we'd known that this would never be expungible. I mean, I will say, you know, it was the same people who, this Christine Soto DeBerry, who was the chief of staff, who like ran this whole thing, who made automatic expungement happen, is also the person who wrote that Prop 47, the first draft of it. So she was like, why did we get this wrong? But you know, the first step was just recognizing that writing a law isn't going to make any difference if it's a year's worth of procedures and paperwork to actually have it come to fruition for any individual. Like, that's, if you don't understand what the people are actually experiencing, the people that you are supposedly helping through writing your law, if you don't understand what they will have to go through to get the benefit of the law, don't write it. Because to your point about the trust and faith thing, you have a criminal record, you're living with that felony, it's a really terrible burden. You hear these things are going to be expunged, I won't have any more. And then it doesn't really happen for you. It's a betrayal.
And every time you try to make headway on it, you just hit another wall, which leads you to be more disaffected and frustrated.
You conclude that this is a trap, that the government does not have your back, that this is a bait and switch. And how does that make you feel about voting? How does that make you feel about participating in civic life? It's a lived experience that I would like the authors of these laws to understand.
We're getting questions. I've got them right here.
You've got them right here.
I do. I'm going to start reading some. And if you all have questions you want to ask Jen, please feel free to send them in. So here's one. An alarming problem I saw in tech was the quote-unquote golden handcuff incentive, keeping talent in the valley. How do we incentivize direct collaboration to build government?
Well, I think I don't know if that's sort of current. Things have changed a lot with the layoffs in the Valley. When I started this work, I was already surprised that so many people wanted to do, for instance, the first year of the Code for America Fellowship, which was 2011. So people applied in 2010. And it was like, I'm embarrassed to tell people at this day, but like it was a fellowship program that paid you $35,000 for the year. So these are people who were otherwise working at like tech companies. And nobody thought anybody would apply. And we had, I think, 525 applications for 20 slots the first year. So there's always been more interest in public service than I think from the tech world than I think people have given credit. But even recognizing that, we have come a really long way. There's a bunch of organizations that work to bring tech people into government who now will tell you, or at least I'll tell you as on their board, like the problem isn't interest, the problem is the civil service system that takes 9 months to hire them. And that's also, by the way, extremely, if your goal is to be unbiased, it's a terrible anti-equity practice. Because if you worked at Google and you have a ton of money, you can wait 9 months. If you actually need another job, you will take another job in the meantime, while we take a 9-month hiring process. So I think we've really come a long way on tech hiring in terms of making it attractive. AI is another issue. There's sort of this, we're not going to get like the folks who are training AI models to come into government right now. They're going to make a lot of money and then we're going to want to come in a couple of years. I'm sure there's exceptions to that. But we can get people who know to use the models. Like, there's a lot that we can do. But I think more importantly, I've really come to the conclusion that we're going to do okay on that front if we actually work instead on the unburdening of the people once they come in. Like that's where I want to kind of shift my focus.
Do you want to say, I think we have a lot of people in the audience who are working in organizations who are trying to think creatively and constructively about how to use tech in order to more effectively advance the kinds of outcomes that we want to see. Do you have advice for them? They're working in an environment where procedures are required to be followed, and the waterfall exists, and they are worrying about the possibilities of getting sued, and political turnover has real implications for how much discretion they do or do not have.
Yeah. I guess my advice, well, first of all, the inscription or the dedication of the book is to public servants everywhere, don't give up. Don't give up is my first piece of advice. Second, there's a woman in chapter 10, I believe, named Yadira Sanchez, and I think she provides a great role model for tech leadership. And it isn't about agile development or, DevOps or even sort of just user-centered design, though I think she is a clear model for being the voice of the user, and that's like a lot of what she did. But her leadership is about insisting on a seat at the table in these policy discussions, and getting to a product that works for people because she's not just accepting what she's given in terms of a requirements list or and it's really just like you do have to kind of get out of your lane, and you will be told to get back in your lane, and you have to politely not. But it's to me it's less about I think when I started this work, I thought it was about having better tech talent, and I think it's now about a different dialogue and a different discussion. And I think there's a lot of tactics for being able to get that seat at the table. And it does not work to sort of scream you're wrong or throw tech jargon around. This isn't user-centered. That's just going to alienate people. But bringing it back to, I think there's something you need to understand about the implications of that decision. I mean, I'll give you one example from Yadira Sanchez, since to sort of bring it to life. She's working on the implementation of the law that came after the ACA, that Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services had to do. It was called MACRA. You don't need to know what it stands for. And it was just very burdensome on doctors. It was supposed to pay doctors better for better quality care, but they were very frustrated in the ways that they had to give CMS their quality data already. And so they were saying, now you're going to make me learn a whole new system. I'm going to have to train my new staff. I have to pay for new HR software because you're going to give me another new system that's going to be confusing and demoralizing. And one of the interpretations of the law that the CMS policy staff came up with was the law exempted doctors who only took a few Medicare patients. But the way they interpreted it was have everybody go through it the first year and then decide that they're exempt. So if you're a sole practitioner who only takes a few Medicare patients, they're saying invest in the HR software, learn the new system, go through this whole thing, and then you won't even have to do it. And she was saying, all those doctors will leave Medicare. They just won't take Medicare patients anymore. There were a number of things like this that were driving doctors away. So a law designed to improve the quality of care is now degrading quality of care by reducing the number of providers available. And it's so easy to say, but the policy team said so, and I guess that's what the law says, so this sucks, but we're gonna have to put them through. And she just didn't give up. She's like, we can't do that. And then she did it very politely.
And she persevered.
She persevered. Hashtag.
Yep. So we have a question about contracting with the private sector. Rather than thinking about changes to government, the incentives, the structure, whatnot, how ought we to think about the conditions under which, having identified a public purpose, we ought to simply turn to the private sector to write the policy and deliver the solution for us?
There's a wide variety of tools in our tool belt. Some of my colleagues now and back when I worked at the White House work on prizes and challenges, which is a great way to sort of say, we don't care how you do it, but here's the challenge. If you can do this, there's going to be a big reward for you. And in fact, I think it was a key element of the success of Operation Warp Speed, which is like something everyone goes like, we did a good job on that. Yay, we have vaccines. So that's appropriate in certain cases. My relationship to sort of the vendor world is complicated because I think that we've set the rules of the game of how vendors are supposed to interact with government very badly. And so when a friend of mine read the first draft of my book, she was like, oh, I thought you were gonna, expose all the bad vendor practices. Like this, I was looking for all the juicy, like, we hate Deloitte stuff. And I was like, no, that's not the book. Because I don't, sure, there are bad, we have these failures where you could blame the vendor, like healthcare.gov or currently the terrible FAFSA application. And of course, the press is reporting, you know what I'm talking about? This is Brown University, everyone knows the FAFSA, which is just heartbreaking. And the Times is reporting that the vendor on that is one of the vendors who worked on healthcare.gov. They're trying to tie this together, we're just hiring bad vendors. We are setting bad rules of the game, and we have to change them. So I'm not, I don't want to just continue to abdicate responsibility to vendors. That's the product management part. That's what government has to do differently. I think there's a lot of times when we are just sort of handing it over to the private sector in ways that don't allow for product management. If you hand it over to the private sector, you're definitely not going to get that great cycle of dialogue between the people who are actually implementing it and the policymakers, because the implementers are now even further from the policy conversation. But I very much believe in the vendor ecosystem. I think it's government's job to change the rules, to bring vendors in as real partners, and I think the vendors overall are going to respond well to those changes. They want them to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a question about the importance of trust in getting to a place where we might have a more agile approach to government.
Yeah.
And we live in a time when there is not a lot of trust in a deep state that is weaponized for political purposes. So much of the dialogue goes, or on one side, or laments about vast waste and incompetence, or these kinds of things that then don't encourage people to come together and to learn from one another and to take each other seriously.
Yeah.
So help us sort of, what does it look like to nudge our way forward against those kinds of headwinds?
Well, I think that my metaphor earlier of asking our elected leaders to be soil tenders instead of just seed planters, I think does play into that a little, because it starts to recognize that these poor outcomes have a cause and that we are all part of that, right? This accountability trap that public servants are stuck on, and I'm saying just as citizens, as the public, we participate in that, and we can have a role in it. I think that if trust is being broken because we're not delivering for people sometimes, not all the time, I think that also derives from a lack of trust in the waterfall, and that can often mean between the branches.
Right.
So since the book came out, I'm suddenly invited to go talk to Hill staffers a lot. So I never spent any time on that side of DC. I was always bopping around different administrative agencies. And now that I'm over there, I'm really blown away that they just have so little trust and so little understanding. And they want to ask the agencies questions, in part to start doing what I talked about, they're hearing me say, you should speak to the implementers before you write this law, and send them a letter and like Leg Affairs gets involved and then no conversation happens. There's this like very low trust both from the Hill to the agencies and the agencies to the Hill. And we've got to break that. It's incredibly destructive. And I think one expression of that trust coming back is what I'm preaching to those Hill staffers, and hopefully it sort of gets at some point to their bosses, is, and some members are actually interested in this, is, you really are talking about one toolkit. You have this control and mandate framework. So when they ask me to come, what they're saying is, this agency is performing poorly. What mandates and controls can we place on them to get better outcomes? And my response to them is, well, you've been doing that for a while. How's it working? And they're like, right, it's not working. But this is the only thing we know how to do. And I don't think that's the only thing that a legislative body can do when trying to improve the performance of an agency. So I have this slide that's like, here's what you do in a mandate and control framework, and here's what you do in an enablement and capacity building framework. But the enablement and capacity building framework 1,000% requires communication. And we have all sorts of things that are sort of set up essentially to stop that communication. So CEG is partnered with an organization called PopFox in DC, and they're starting these interbranch exchanges just to get people on the Hill like talking to people in agencies. Half of what I do in DC is say, oh, I'm gonna be at a bar on Thursday night, and invite someone from the Hill and someone from the agency, because that's not illegal. They can go to bars.
Just bars?
They can go to social events and happen to find out that the person that they need to talk to happens to be sitting there. That's not illegal.
That's hilarious.
But those two people cannot actually arrange a meeting without going afoul of.
You can.
I can,
Yep.
And I will, and that's what
Yep.
PopFox is doing a lot of that, and it's incredible what happens when people start talking to each other.
Amazing. Can we drop down to the state level and the city level? Are there states and/or cities that you think are doing a particularly good job of adopting these practices, incorporating tech into governance in ways that are smart and impactful? And coupled with that, are there lessons that Chicago should be aware of when they think about replication, pitfalls to avoid? Mm-hmm. Presumably you don't just say what they're doing, then we should do.
I'm most interested in the states that not only have created a digital service, which I think of as one example of something but again, it's not all about tech for me, right? But where you have governors and their key staffs who are actually not just saying, let's have this team, but let's spend a lot of time with them, right? I talked with the Code PA team, so it's this like little digital service unit in Pennsylvania government, and they're just like over the moon. They just feel like they have the right leader who listens to them and cares about them. And I've seen that work. And I'll give you an example. It's not the governor, but New Jersey's doing really well. They have a great team. Colorado's doing really well too. But I went to the New Jersey Department of Labor kind of at the sort of I don't know, when did COVID end? It sort of never ended. But like, we weren't in the COVID mess anymore, but we were starting to be able to sort of take a look back at what had happened on unemployment insurance. And they had had the same, just knocked over by a tidal wave that every other state had, but they stood back up a lot quicker. And one reason is that they had an Office of Innovation that already had a great relationship with DOL. They'd been working with them, not knowing that this was going to happen. And so they were able to come in, they had great trust. But the other thing that happened there that I just feel like I don't know how to make this replicable, but the Commissioner of Labor, Rob Ansaro Angelo, sat in every meeting. He was just like, this is only going to get fixed if I'm in the room. So when the team says, oh, wait, but this is a barrier, I can say, no, it's not. We'll take care of it. And there was literally no distance between the surfacing of a burden or barrier on the team to doing what they knew they need to do, and that burden being removed. And there's just, I mean, I know that that can't happen all the time, and our elected leaders do have to be in other meetings, but the courage then and like clarity that he came to that task with and said, we need to get people this benefit, that's only gonna happen if I'm there and I really care. And we just need so much more attention to implementation, but the evidence is irrefutable that it results in delivery.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question that I want to read sort of word for word because I think it raises some really important and nettlesome issues when we think about grafting the advice that you're offering into a political world where there is real disagreements about the purposes of government and a belief that the provisions of some benefits shouldn't be extended. So the question is, some online tools feel intentionally hard. For example, online U.S. visa application process. It's one example. We could think of others. Are there areas that you feel tech faces friction because it increases accessibility or improves the process? That is.
Wait, say the second sentence again.
Are there areas that you feel tech faces friction because it increases accessibility or improves the process? You could go in and say, it doesn't have to be this difficult. We do exactly what you describe, and therefore we have even more people wanting to come into the country or wanting access to a benefit, and those who are concerned about immigration flows or the provisions of benefits are not going to be on board with making it easier.
Undeniably that happens. Don Moynihan and Pam Hurd have a book called Administrative Burden, Policy Making by Other Means is their subtitle, by which they mean if you can't, if you're in a state where the political environment is such that they don't want a benefit given out, but the law says it is, you can keep that benefit from being given out by having, by creating administrative burden. You can think of it as used by the left and the right? So if you don't want people to get abortions, you can create administrative burden. If you don't want people to get guns, you can create administrative burden. The right would call, gun licensing administrative burden. Just depends on what you care about. I do not deny that that happens, but I do think that my own experience has very, very often been that where administrative burden seems intentional, it actually isn't. California is a great example of that. We had the second lowest participation rate in SNAP in the country when we started our work on simplifying that form. There was nobody in California didn't want people to have that. I mean, there are some red counties in California, but they have like 5 people in them. Like the vast majority of California is in big blue cities, and it was embarrassing to the state that they had such a low participation rate. Wyoming was the only state with the worst participation rate and it was just that we couldn't get out of our own way. We had too much money and sort of made a mega project that had 212 questions on the form. But I see this over and over again. I will say, since visa applications came up, there is a fantastic team at DHS now trying to streamline a bunch of these applications that have to do with refugees, et cetera. And man, it would break my heart to think that people think that the bureaucrats there are trying to not help people. Like they're trying so hard to make these things better. Politically, that's a different story. We have a very bad political problem in that area. But to the extent that we can make the processes easier for people within, our existing political environment, there is an incredibly genuine and powerful effort to try to make that better.
Can I take away from that maybe part of the advice is to just do the work and to pay less attention to the headlines that are often strident and painting with broad brushstrokes about the evil and incompetent administrative state, and say we're not going to engage that. We're going to set to work on doing this good work in order to generate better outcomes and the winds will be had and the political tides will turn when those outcomes are realized.
I think another way of saying that is work on what you can control. And I think we can make these things better in order to stop alienating the public from the political process. That is in our control. It's not easy, but we can work on that. And yeah, so I think you're sort of working on the core, one of the core causes of alienation that drives a dysfunctional political system instead of working at the political level. I value all kinds of work. I just don't know how to do the politics. I want to work on the stuff that I can control, where there is a will to make it better, and we just need to bring different practices to the table.
And is that some of the work that you hope that this book will do? That is, encourage people to think more expansively and imaginatively about possibilities and to set to work locally where silos and waterfalls are not sort of structuring everything that they do, that they try to break through and to pay attention to outcomes as communities that have been separated in this process are brought into meaningful dialogue.
Yeah, I say somewhere in the book that a lot of this is sort of a failure of imagination to believe that it can be different. I think to the earlier question about talent, I think I say it specifically about, we just have these ideas that startups and Google or whatever have all the tech talent, and it's just like, it's not true, and we can't imagine something different. We have to believe something different. But I think it's true more broadly. Telling stories like Yadira's, who just at the end of her macro project, the implementation of it was called QPP. She ships something that's not only on time and under budget, but the doctors are calling in saying, "I must be on the wrong website. This is too easy." So I did sort of want to move the Overton window a little bit in sort of terms of what, this wasn't something you'd imagine, this is something that happened, but so many people believe that is sort of impossible, right, So, but I really, now that it's out, I'm kind of craving to move it further. And I see models out there where the dialogue between policy and delivery is much, much tighter than anything that we can imagine here, like what they're doing in the UK. And I want to keep pushing people's imagination to, we're not just trapped in this waterfall.
That's a great place to end. Thank you for sharing your vision, your knowledge, and writing this terrific book and spending time with us.
I have had such a good time here. Thank you so much. I really want to come back. It's a really, really wonderful environment.
That's
here.
terrific. So let's thank Jen. And there are copies of the book upstairs, and Jen will be available to
Yes.
sign some copies.
I would love to do that. Great. See you upstairs.
Great.